Before we dive in, viewer discretion is strongly advised, not because of graphic images or shocking language, but because this is the kind of content that challenges deeply held narratives. What you are about to witness is what happens when the boogeyman of the American right, the so-called crazy radical leftist, the communist in disguise, the existential threat to capitalism, turns out not to be a shouting agitator or a chaos-loving revolutionary, but a soft-spoken 33-year-old man in a perfectly tailored suit, a man who speaks calmly, deliberately, and with the moral clarity of someone who has spent more time studying Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. than scrolling through outrage-driven headlines, a man whose serenity alone seems to short-circuit the political hysteria built around him. This is the story of what happens when a delusional caricature collides with reality under the unforgiving lights of national television. When a political establishment, trained to fight straw men and exaggerated villains, suddenly finds itself face to face with a real person, measured, composed, and devastatingly precise, what unfolds is not a debate in the traditional sense, but a collision of realities. On one side stands the apocalyptic narrative pushed relentlessly by the conservative machine. According to this narrative, Zohran Mamdani is an agent of chaos, a Trojan horse for tyranny, a man whose ideas will tear apart the economic fabric of New York City and plunge America into socialist ruin. He is portrayed as reckless, dangerous, and fundamentally un-American, a walking disaster wrapped in progressive slogans. This story has been repeated so often, so loudly, that for many viewers it has become accepted truth without scrutiny. On the other side sits the man himself, unflappable, calm, almost disarmingly polite. He does not raise his voice, he does not interrupt, he does not perform outrage for the cameras. Instead, he listens carefully, answers precisely, and speaks with a confidence that does not rely on volume or theatrics. He comes armed not with slogans, but with a populist message so coherent and resonant that it has forced even the White House to take notice. Donald Trump has labeled him a communist, pundits have dismissed him as a madman, political operatives have whispered warnings behind closed doors, and Eric Adams, once expected to dominate the race, chose to flee rather than face him head-on. That alone should have raised eyebrows, but when Zohran Mamdani sat down at the table on Times, The View, an arena known more for spectacle than substance, he did not bring fire and brimstone. He brought something far more dangerous to the political class, a mirror. For 40 uninterrupted minutes, he held that mirror up to New York's political establishment and forced them to confront their own failures. He did not accuse, he did not insult, he simply described reality, calmly, relentlessly, and without blinking. Rising rents, stagnant wages, a housing market designed for investors, not residents, a city where working families are punished for staying and politicians are rewarded for looking the other way. This was not just an interview. It was an exorcism of the old guard. As the conversation unfolded, something remarkable happened. The usual talking points, fear of socialism, warnings about fiscal collapse, lectures on basic economics, began to sound hollow. While pundits screamed into microphones from the safety of their YouTube channels about fiat currency and market fundamentals, Mamdani was busy doing something far more radical, explaining, in plain language, why millions of Americans cannot afford to live in the cities they work in, and why people currently in charge are terrified of the solutions. Terrified, not because the solutions don't work, but because they threaten entrenched interests. The atmosphere in the studio was electric. You could feel it vibrating beneath the surface, an unmistakable tension that comes when a city senses it may be standing at the edge of something historic. The audience applause was raucous and sustained, not just the polite clapping of a daytime show crowd, but a volatile mix of genuine excitement and nervous energy. This was the sound of people seeing a political lightning rod in the flesh and realizing he didn't look anything like they had been warned. At one point, the host had to step in half joking and half serious. "Hold on now. We've got an hour of the show, so y'all are going to have to calm down so we can actually talk to him." But calming down was easier said than done, because what the audience was witnessing wasn't merely a charismatic candidate performing well on television. It was the collapse of a carefully constructed myth. The realization that the so-called radical wasn't ranting, the supposed extremist wasn't unstable, and the alleged threat to democracy was, in fact, one of the most composed figures the stage had seen in years. And that is what made the moment so unsettling for the establishment. Zohran Mamdani didn't need to attack anyone. He let the contrast speak for itself, between hysteria and calm, between fear and explanation, between slogans and solutions. In doing so, he exposed not just policy failures, but a deeper moral bankruptcy, a political culture more invested in maintaining power than solving problems. This was not a viral clip manufactured for outrage. It was a sustained reckoning, and by the time the interview ended, one thing was undeniable. Whether you agreed with him or not, the old narratives no longer worked. The mirror had been held up, and once people see their reflection clearly, there is no going back. Whoopi Goldberg raised her hand and commanded the room into silence. It wasn't theatrical. It was surgical. The moment demanded control. The energy in the studio had surged past polite enthusiasm and into something volatile, something that needed to be contained before it could be examined. Applause faded into murmurs. Cameras steadied, and at the center of it all sat Zohran Mamdani, suddenly still. He looked nothing like the radical fire brand so many had been warned about. No clenched fists, no raised voice, no performative outrage. Instead, he looked like the smartest student in a graduate seminar, the one who listens more than he speaks, who waits patiently, and when he finally does speak, reframes the entire discussion. His posture was relaxed, his expression attentive, almost curious. Across the table, the hosts, representatives of the mainstream democratic establishment, studied him with a blend of curiosity and quiet condescension. They didn't see a threat, not yet. They saw a 33-year-old upstart, a novelty, a sudden media phenomenon whose moment they assumed would pass as quickly as it arrived. Joy Behar leaned forward, setting the tone. "Now, a year ago, you were a largely unknown state assemblyman," she remarked, carefully emphasizing the word unknown. The implication was clear. Obscurity is a weakness, and relevance is something bestowed, not earned. Then she added with a smirk, "And now at 33 years old, please. I've got hula hoops older than you. I'm older than you." She joked. The audience laughed. It was a classic power move, a subtle but deliberate attempt to infantilize the guest, to remind viewers of his youth and, by extension, his supposed inexperience. In political television, age isn't just a number, it's a hierarchy, and the message was unmistakable. You're impressive, sure, but you're not ready. This was the bait. Many candidates would have taken it. A nervous laugh, a forced defense, a clumsy attempt to sound older, tougher, more presidential. But Mamdani didn't flinch. He didn't rush to prove himself. He didn't correct her. He didn't push back. He smiled. Then, with impeccable manners and perfect timing, he said calmly, "It really is a joy to be here." The audience laughed again, but this time differently. And with that simple sentence, he executed the first pivot of the interview. When asked to explain his meteoric rise, he didn't talk about strategy. He didn't boast about political instincts or media savvy. He didn't credit consultants or momentum. Instead, he did something profoundly disarming. He talked about humility. A lot of times, he said softly, politicians will lecture New Yorkers about what they should care about. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried, clear, measured, reaching the back of the room. What we wanted to do was go out to New Yorkers and ask them, "What do you care about?" There was a pause, and we heard the same answer again and again. He continued, "Cost of living, cost of living, cost of living." The repetition wasn't accidental. It was rhythmic, almost musical. He began listing the grievances, not rhetorically but methodically. Rent, childcare, groceries, transportation, the dollar too. 90 bus fare. Each word landed with weight, not because it was dramatic, but because it was familiar. These weren't abstract policy points. They were daily anxieties. The room grew quiet. He framed his entire campaign not as an ideological crusade, but as a direct response to suffering. He wasn't selling a theory. He was answering a cry. This wasn't about imposing socialism, as his critics claimed. It was about delivering affordability, about survival, about dignity. And just like that, the trap of inexperience collapsed. He wasn't too young to lead. He was the only one actually listening. As the interview moved forward, the pleasantries slowly fell away. The conversation turned sharper, more dangerous. There was blood in the water. Eric Adams, the sitting mayor, the embodiment of the Democratic establishment, had dropped out of the race rather than confront him, Danny, directly. The hosts played a clip. Adams appeared on screen, grave and stern, warning viewers about extremism and chaos. Beware of those who claim they have the answers while seeking to destroy the very system we built, Adams warned. That is chaos. It was a thinly veiled attack. Everyone knew it. The camera cut back to the table. The host turned to him. Danny, what is your response to that? This was the moment candidates are trained for. The moment to defend, to clarify, to reassure donors, to sound safe, to retreat into vague language and platitudes about balance and pragmatism. This was the moment to get rattled. Danny didn't. He didn't bristle. He didn't counterattack. He didn't even look offended. Instead, he leaned forward slightly, his expression steady, almost sympathetic. He didn't respond as a man under siege. He responded as a man holding the mirror again. He spoke not about destroying systems, but about who those systems were destroying. About a city where working people were being priced out while politicians congratulated themselves on stability. About how chaos isn't change, it's a status quo that forces families to choose between rent and food. His calm was devastating, because the louder the accusations sounded, the more unreasonable they appeared next to his composure. The contrast was unmistakable. Fear versus clarity. Alarm versus explanation. By the time he finished speaking, the accusation of chaos felt hollow, almost desperate, and in that moment, something shifted in the room. This wasn't a rebellious newcomer crashing the party. This was a reckoning. A generational confrontation carried out not with rage, but with restraint, not with slogans, but with substance. The establishment had come prepared to correct a child. Instead, they found themselves being taught. Many candidates would have bristled at the personal attack. Many would have taken it as an insult, a provocation, an invitation to trade blows. But Zohran Mamdani stayed in the pocket. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't lash out. He didn't attack Eric Adams as a person. Instead, he did something far more dangerous to an incumbent politician. He attacked his math. The most extreme thing I can think of, Mamdani said calmly, are the policies he's delivered to this city over the last 4 years. With that sentence, he redefined the word extreme. He wasn't speaking in abstractions. He wasn't relying on ideology. He was talking about numbers, about outcomes, about consequences. He didn't use rhetoric. He used receipts. This is a mayor who raised the rent by 12% on 2 million people. He stated, letting the statistic fall into the room like a heavy stone. There was no flourish, no dramatic pause. Just the number, and numbers, unlike slogans, have gravity. He then walked the audience through the mechanics of how that happened. The Rent Guidelines Board, 9 members, all appointed by the mayor. A body most New Yorkers had never thought about, let alone understood. Mamdani demystified it in real time, peeling back the bureaucratic curtain and exposing how poverty is often not accidental, but procedural. The previous mayor froze rents 3 times. He added, almost casually, that single sentence did something remarkable. It reframed his so-called radicalism as something else entirely, not revolution, but restoration. Not extremism, but a return to sanity. His ideas weren't unprecedented. They were simply abandoned. The audience murmured, not an outrage, but recognition. Somewhere far away, the conservative narrator, watching from a distance, could scream into a microphone about inflation. He could warn that landlords would stop putting apartments on the market. He could repeat the eternal mantra that nothing in life is free, and maybe, in another context, those arguments would find traction. But inside that studio, Mamdani was painting a different picture, a picture of a system rigged not by fate or economics alone, but by specific people making specific choices, decisions with names attached to them. Votes, appointments, policies. He had survived the local skirmish. He had dismantled the charge of extremism with calm precision. But now the hosts were ready to escalate. The gloves were coming off. It was time to talk about the man in the White House. It was time to talk about the C word. Donald Trump had a lot to say about Zohran Mamdani. He had called him a communist, a radical, a threat, the kind of labels Trump had perfected over years of political warfare. For many candidates, this would have been the moment of panic, the moment to rush to the center, to reassure nervous voters, to distance themselves from the accusation as quickly as possible. But Mamdani wasn't afraid of the big bad wolf. The skirmish over rent stabilization had merely been the opening jab. Now the host prepared to unleash the heavy artillery. The shadow of Donald Trump, the man who had dominated and distorted American politics for nearly a decade, loomed over the table. To the political establishment, Trump is a monster to be feared, a force that must be tiptoed around, endlessly explained, carefully neutralized. To Zohran Mamdani, he was something else entirely, just another loud voice in a room that desperately needed to quiet down. "Okay," the host said, shifting her tone, "let's talk about President Trump, because he had a lot to say about you." With that, the battlefield shifted. This was no longer about New York City alone. This was national now. She listed the attacks with grim efficiency, ticking them off like charges in an indictment. Communist, radical, socialist, dangerous, un-American. Each label had been deployed before, sharpened by repetition, designed to provoke fear rather than thought. "Let's quickly tick through all the things that," she began. This was the moment candidates usually stumble, the moment they rush to deny labels instead of dismantling them, the moment they allow their opponent to define the terms of the debate. Mamdani didn't take the bait. He didn't sound defensive. He didn't sound angry. He didn't sound eager to please. He sounded grounded. Instead of arguing about names, he talked about outcomes. Instead of debating Trump's rhetoric, he talked about people's lives. He refused to let the conversation stay at the level of insult. If Trump wanted to call him a communist, Mamdani seemed to say, "Fine, let's talk about what that accusation actually means in practice. Let's talk about whether people can afford rent, whether parents can afford childcare, whether workers can survive in the cities they sustain." In doing so, he neutralized the attack without ever directly addressing it, and that was the most unsettling part. Trump's power has always relied on forcing his opponents to react, to flinch, to overcorrect, to play defense. Mamdani refused. He didn't shrink from the accusation, nor did he obsess over it. He simply kept talking about reality. The contrast was stark, one side shouting labels from afar, the other calmly explaining systems up close. As the exchange unfolded, it became clear that Mamdani wasn't just surviving the interview, he was controlling it. Not through dominance, but through discipline. Not through aggression, but through clarity. This wasn't the performance of a man auditioning for approval. It was the posture of someone who knew exactly why he was there. And by the time the segment moved forward, one thing was undeniable. The scare words were losing their power, not because Mamdani had argued them away, but because he had rendered them irrelevant. Fear had met facts. And facts, spoken calmly, have a way of changing the room. The question hung in the air like a storm cloud over the studio. "Number one," the host said, her voice steady but deliberate, "he's attacking you as a communist, are you?" The word communist seemed to reverberate in the room, heavy and electric. Communist, in American politics, it is the nuclear option. It is the label that doesn't invite discussion. It shuts it down. It evokes images of breadlines, of totalitarian regimes, of gulags and oppression. It is meant to terrify, to isolate, to disqualify without debate. Every viewer, every pundit, every conservative commentator watching from afar had already formed the script in their minds. To them, Zohran Mamdani was the villain of the narrative, a crazy radical leftist whose ideas would destroy New York City, undo decades of careful economic planning, and invite chaos into daily life. The promises of rent control, the proposals for universal child care, the calls for better wages, all of these were not gestures of empathy or policy innovation. To them, these were the mechanical signs of economic apocalypse, denials of fiat currency principles, breaches of market logic, violations of basic laws of supply and demand. They waited for him to stutter, to flinch, to retreat into a defensive crouch, to panic, to recite talking points, to deny. But Mamdani did not. He did not flinch. He did not stumble. He did not hesitate. He met the accusation not with panic or fury, but with precise correction. "No," he said, his voice calm, measured, level. "I'm a democratic socialist." The words were not shouted. There was no defensive edge. There was no apology. Instead, there was clarity. "That means," he continued, his tone unashamed, "I believe in dignity for all people." And then he expanded, refusing to let the label hang over him like a slur, refusing to let it poison the conversation. "It means more than that," he added, leaning slightly forward, his eyes meeting the cameras and the hosts alike. The host pressed deliberately, trying to gauge whether he understood the weight of the accusation. After all, to call someone a communist in this country is not casual. It is to summon fear, to suggest betrayal, to invoke suspicion. "I think you're not a communist," the host conceded after a brief pause. "I agree with that," Mamdani replied with steady composure, but the question still lingered. What is he then? How should people understand this new political figure, who had suddenly appeared from the shadows of New York's political scene, to confront the established order? Instead of turning to dense ideological texts or quoting Marx, Lenin, or other revolutionary theorists, Mamdani took a different approach. He invoked a figure whose moral authority in America is nearly unimpeachable, whose words have become sacred in the narrative of national ethics and justice. "I tell them to think about the words of Dr. King," he said, wrapping himself in the moral legitimacy of the civil rights movement. He invoked King not as a prop, but as a guiding principle, a philosophical and ethical compass. He continued, "Call it democracy, or call it democratic socialism. There has to be a better distribution of wealth for all of God's children in this country." It was, in essence, a rhetorical judo throw. The accusation of being a communist, a term designed to instill fear, was suddenly reframed. He neutralized it by linking the label to the universal morality of one of America's most beloved and respected figures. By doing so, he made the accusation not merely irrelevant, but morally untenable. To attack Mamdani now, one would implicitly have to attack Dr. King, whose words decades later remain beyond reproach. The effect in the studio was subtle but palpable. The air, already charged with tension, seemed to stabilize. Viewers in the audience leaned forward. Pundits watching from afar could feel their preformed narratives being undermined, not by anger, but by logic and moral framing. This was strategy, this was discipline, this was political theater executed with surgical precision. Mamdani refused to play the game by the old rules. He did not retreat. He did not react emotionally. Instead, he redirected the conversation toward the ethical stakes that the labels had been meant to obscure. But the war was not confined to one battlefield. The fight was happening on multiple fronts. Trump, of course, had already positioned himself as the ultimate antagonist in this story. His voice loomed over every discussion, from conservative media outlets to late-night cable shows. Trump had called Mamdani a communist. He had repeated the warning, "This man is dangerous, un-American, a radical." Many candidates would have folded under the weight of such a declaration, retreating to a safer position, trying to convince voters that the labels were wrong. But Mamdani had done something different. He redefined the conversation entirely. He did not argue about ideology or theory. He argued about people, about dignity, about fairness. He took a term meant to disarm him and turned it into a moral imperative. It was a brilliant inversion. By framing his beliefs as consistent with the ethical demands of Dr. King's vision, Mamdani transformed fear into responsibility. The audience was forced to reconsider. If advocating for dignity, fairness, and economic justice is a threat, then whose morality is under question? The challengers or the status quo's? This was not merely defense. It was offense masquerading as ethics. He had taken the most extreme label in American politics and stripped it of its power, leaving only the question of whether the country would live up to its own moral standards. And the drama didn't end there. The issue of labels and accusations was only the beginning. Beneath the surface, the broader battle loomed. How would Mamdani navigate not just the hostile press, not just the fear-mongering, but the entrenched power structures themselves? How would he confront a president with decades of influence, a political class conditioned to fight reaction with fear, and a public trained to respond emotionally rather than rationally? All of that hung in the air, tense and unspoken, as the interview continued. Mamdani, calm, precise, and morally grounded, had turned a potential moment of crisis into an illustration of his philosophy. He had not only survived the attack, he had transformed it into an opportunity, a platform to articulate the ethical and practical core of his campaign. This, in the end, is the heart of the encounter. The communist label, designed as a weapon, became a rhetorical shield. The fear intended to destabilize him became a moment to highlight the moral stakes of policy, governance, and justice. And in doing so, Mamdani had shown the audience, the hosts, and the critics alike that courage in politics is not about shouting louder than your opponent. It's about speaking the truth, ethically and unflinchingly, even when the world expects panic.